Looking for something to do after Halloween is over? Are you into the strange, bizarre, and unusual? On November 3rd, 4th, and 5th, the Strange Realities Conference is coming back to Nashville, Tennessee, and streaming online. Come join us for 3 days exploring mysteries, supernatural, the occult, weird history, and more, featuring lectures, presentations, and workshops by Tim Banal, Zach Hunt, Leslin Vance, Bryn Collier, Tobias Whalen, Brent Rains, Joshua Cutchin, Kiki Dombrowski, Recluse, Nathan Isaac, Christopher Ernst, Aaron Goulias, David Metcalf, Timothy Renner, Mallory Sawinski, Soraya Ascap, and special guest Steve Berg as your Master of Ceremonies. Make sure to join us for the fun and informative weekend online and at SIR Nashville November 3rd and 4th and online only November 5th. Tickets are available at strangerealitiesconference.com.
Okay, everybody. Welcome to Conspirinormal.
Yes, and we are connecting from across the world to our guest tonight.
Yes. It is very early, or it's very late where he is at the moment, but we're very happy to have this guest on, Mr. Fred Andersson, all the way from Sweden. and Fred, you're actually the second guest we had on from Sweden, right?
Yeah.
Mr. Phil? Carl Abrahamson was on, I believe, a couple times.
Oh,
Yeah.
Carl.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, we're going back to Sweden on this one.
Yeah. Well, Carl is so nice. I had the honor to have one of my texts in, I think, issue number 10 of the Fenris Wolf. Yeah,
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So it's I haven't met him for a while now, but a really nice guy with so much knowledge about the occult and esoteric and everything like that. I love Carl.
Sure.
What was that work that you wrote for Fenris Wolf 10?
Oh yeah, that's a strange text I wrote. It's are you familiar with the documentary Bloodline that came I don't know, maybe 10 years ago? It's about, of course, the hunt for Jesus' grave at Rennes-le-Château.
Yes.
in France.
Yeah.
And I got so fascinated by that documentary because it's one of the participants in it is Ben Hammett. I think his real name is Ben Wilkinson. He's a known hoaxer. No one knew this when they filmed the documentary, but he built his own, grave chamber, and he pretended it was located out in the woods there on the French countryside, and everyone believed him, and they kind of built this whole documentary around him. So I wrote the text about him and how he basically created his own reality by building this myth about the grave he found. I mean, he wrote a book, I think it's like 600-page long book about his hunt for this grave also. And he's such a good writer, and I love the book even if it's made up, and I love how they use him in this documentary. And it's so bizarre seeing a documentary where I mean, it is a good documentary, but when you're aware that this guy comes in and everything he does in it it's fake, and they don't know it, but they think it's real.
Yeah.
That's a kind of a mind fuck, and I love it.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
The whole Rennes-le-Château thing, we could do like an entire episode on that. Like that's
I mean,
big subject.
It is, and I feel. I mean, I have a ton of books about it, and I've seen a lot of stuff, but I feel it's quite complex, big story around it, and it's so many rabbit holes to go into. But it's fascinating. But I mean, Bloodline is without a doubt my favorite documentary on the subject.
I haven't seen that, Adam. Have you seen that?
No, I've never seen that one. I'm not.
I'm
seen
looking
that
at the IMDb. I see Tracy Twyman was involved. Of course, she was really into that stuff for a while with
one. Yeah,
the
she was into the
rise.
Merovingian stuff. Yeah.
Yeah,
Weird.
you should look at you should check it out because it's one of those. It's cozy. It feels very investigative documentary. They following leads. It kind of feels like the Da Vinci Code, but real and real without with quotation marks here. Not quotation marks. Sorry, you know what I mean.
Yeah.
But it's quite difficult, I think, to find the DVD nowadays. I'm not sure, but I recommend it. It's a great one. Read his book also. It's like it's a page turner. It's great.
Fred, you have a book out called
Yeah.
Northern Lights, and it is all about not just UFOs, but high strangeness in Sweden, where you live.
Yeah.
What I ask everybody, if they haven't been on the show before, how you kind of became interested in these topics. I understand that you have a background in television production as well. So
Yeah, of course. I mean, do you want me to go all the way back or just the
Let's go all the way back.
all the way
yeah,
back?
yeah.
I mean, I often say that my mom gave me a book called the Amazing Saucers, a Swedish book published in the 70s, and I fell so much in love with it. It's a quite skeptical book because it was written by a Russian-Swedish journalist called Eugen Semichov. And this book was so packed with interesting cases, for a little Swedish boy reading about, the Lonnie Zamora in Socorro and Betty and Barney Hill and stuff like that. Kind of changed my world. And at the same time I was reading this, me and my mom were living in quite a conservative religious community, very conservative. You weren't really allowed to look or think about stuff that was outside the religious part of it. But I couldn't stay away from it because I mean, living in such a community, which by itself was pretty strange, with speaking in tongues and miracles and lots of quite strange characters around you, kind of just made me more interested in the weird around and symbolism. I mean, if you ever entered a church or was more a evangelistic community, they had these weird paintings showing the rapture, and that kind of it's triggered. I wasn't scared, but it triggered my interest in the weird. So this UFO book, and being raised in a religious community, kind of set it all off. It made me so curious. And I remember my dad's partner, my parents are divorced since many years back. She told me, I remember over the kitchen table one morning, that she had seen a silver sphere hovering above the parking lot where she lived as a child. And then she died. So I never had the chance to talk with her more about it. But I think these are, three things: the religious community, the UFO book, and my father's partner, her story, kind of made me who I am today, basically. I'd say, it's so much fun to dig and stuff like this, and especially when it's local. So a couple of years ago, I started, I'm getting older, and I feel that, okay, I need to start focusing on stuff that I really love to do. And I've been working in television for like 20 years now. And I got a job doing a paranormal show, maybe in 2015, 14, somewhere there, and I did 50 episodes for them, and we visited the whole series is 350 episodes, and I did 50
Wow.
of them. Yeah, so you visited haunted homes in Sweden together with a psychic medium. So that was my normal day-to-day life for a couple of years, and I had the chance there to sit down and talk with so much people because I was doing the interviews, and of course they told me about what's happening in their homes and their ideas and theories about that, but we often started to talk about other things they experienced, stuff that often got cut out from the show itself. It could be that they had seen strange lights in the forest or in the sky above their house. Or I remember one woman who basically got attacked, she claimed, by a giant troll in her house, a big hairy troll. And
Nice.
those stories kind of, I must admit, when I started doing that show, I was very, very, very skeptical to everything. I mean, I was basically an atheist when it came to all things, not just religion, but the paranormal. But after doing that for a couple of years, I was like, there is something in this, I mean. Yeah, because when you talk to people so close and for a couple of hours each time, and you start to, you get pretty good at reading people. You can see when they're bullshitting or not, because there was always bullshitters out there. And that kind of made me even more interested. And in 2019, I had a chance to be the main researcher and story producer for Spökjakt, which is a huge paranormal show here in Scandinavia. One of the biggest successes ever, actually. And we recently shot season 5 and 6. We won a lot of prizes, awards, and after doing that, with just a lot of ghosts, I decided, okay, I need to focus on what I'm really, really interested in, and that's the weirder stuff: UFOs, monsters, creatures, and yeah. At the moment, I'm working on a UFO show, a 4-part series that will be aired next year on one of the big TV channels, and it's so much fun. I mean, it's my dream come true, to be honest,
That's
to do
so
that.
cool.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah,
That's great.
yeah, and it's like this show. It's the first of its kind in Sweden, so we can do so much. I mean, it's unknown territory for most people. We can go and look at those cases that just been mentioned in books earlier, so not even that. I mean, we just started, so I
Yeah.
who knows where it might lead, but we've been shooting 6 days so far, and I'm so happy with the footage and the people we met.
Sounds like you might have a little bit more freedom in format than maybe a lot of markets with so much pre-existing stuff like in the States for paranormal television.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, Spökjakt, this other paranormal show, is kind of feels, the traditional American or British setup. There's a team and they go to a haunted place and they stay there overnight. But we also focus on making it so cinematic as possible. It's very, very far visually in a good way from all the shows in the United States.
Yeah, no, totally get it.
So many of them. So I'm super happy to been able to be there early and affect the outcome of that show. And with the UFO show, we're doing it very how to describe it, quite intimate, quite. It might sound amateurish to say that we improvise a lot, because we don't, but we focus on having that feeling that when we go to a small town, we of course we have some fixed things we need to do. We need to meet some witnesses. We need to do some reenactment. But then whatever happens, and there's always stories to be told when you go out in these places. As soon as you start talking with people, they have always something to tell, and that's it's wonderful. Yeah.
Well, it sounds like these shows have kind of gave you this ability to conduct like a big survey or study.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's doing what I've done with the paranormal show and the UFO show now. Kind of, it feels like comparing to my own book that I've been correct in my assessments in the book. Where and how and these things happen, and it's so cool to actually go out to these places and experience the places themselves and meet the people. So I'm very, very grateful for having the job I have at the moment, because it's a blast. It's a blast.
In Sweden, is it a big UFO hotspot? The thing I think about with Sweden is the ghost rockets from the late 1940s.
Yeah, I mean the ghost rockets. I often say with the ghost rockets that when I first heard about them, I felt okay. It's like some rockets or missiles, or it didn't seem so weird to me. But after looking into it and reading and hearing Claes Svan, who's kind of the main UFO guy here in Sweden, his speciality is the ghost rockets. When he starts to talk about these cases, everything turns so weird, because it's so much weirder than you can imagine when you go into the subject of the ghost rockets. And it's, I mean, we had in 46 we had like at least 1,000 observation of these things, and in 100 of those cases they crashed into lakes, as you're aware of, and these lake crashes are so common in Sweden. I mean, we have lake crashes in lake in modern times, very, very similar things to the stuff that happened in 46. And it kind of I'm no expert on that case, but on those cases, but it kind of it makes me I'm in awe of these observations, because they're truly unexplained. I mean, they're a true mystery in every way possible. I mean, and before the ghost rockets, we have the ghost airplanes that were seen all over Sweden and Norway. And we had a couple of really interesting things happening in the 40s also, before Roswell and Kenneth Arnold. So there is a lot to dig into. Nowadays, though, I'd say that the interest for UFOs are big in Sweden. I mean, even the newspaper starts to write about it, and we have these productions and we have some podcasts. But modern sightings in Sweden, I'd say that 99% of them are quite boring. It's basically someone who sees a bright dot in the sky. Sure. And that's all over the world like that. But if you go back to the 60s or 70s or even 80s, it's wild. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote the book, because I wanted to share these cases with an international crowd. I want to let people know how much weirdness we have.
And you had mentioned too, when we were talking before we started, that there was a major flap in 1973, which that was a huge year around the world for UFOs.
Yeah, absolutely. That's it was in 74, but in 73 there was another flap, actually a big one. It seemed even in Sweden that the early 70s were kind of the main period for this really interesting observations and encounters, both with humanoids and flying saucers, as I love to call them, flying saucers. So it was a different time, and in many ways it was a more fun times, a more weird time in Sweden. I'm born in 1977, so of course I didn't experience these things myself or read about them then. But just looking at it, going into archives and reading old books and magazine, you'll find a lot of fantastic things happening. I mean, regarding this UFO flap, I've written about both the UFO flaps, the 73 and the 74, in the book, which had, tons of witnesses and are truly mysteries to this day. And they also set in the Swedish countryside, which I feel is the place to go if you're going to experience something like that here in Sweden.
So as I was reading your book, I was curious about if there's any researchers that we would not know in the United States, researcher personalities from Sweden that like inspired you, or that you have a particular interest in, or that did some really good work on these subjects.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, two I mentioned quite often in the book is Håkan Blomqvist and Claes Svan. Håkan is always, I mean, he has a past in UFO cults as a member. As a teenager, he became involved in these contactee groups in Sweden. This was at the beginning of the 70s, but he left those groups years after and became for a while quite a skeptic and very anti these kind of more esoteric things. But he in the 80s he started to be in peace with his past, and he's written a lot of great stuff when it comes to especially contactees and channeling stuff. When it comes to contact with alleged alien entities, and he's done great work. He's written a lot in Swedish, a couple of books on the subject. He also have a blog in English where there's a lot of interesting articles. I can send you a link to that because it's a great read, and he have he's very much into high strangeness, so he always digs up the most weird stuff he can find. And when it comes to Swedish contactees, there's always a very high weirdness, high strangeness surrounding them. Claes Svan, who's a guy I think you should have as a guest sometime, is kind of the guy that everyone goes to in Sweden and sometimes the world when it comes to the UFO phenomenon. He's a journalist, and he do very careful work when researching cases. He meets witnesses. He turns every stone when it comes to stuff out there. He's written tons of books. I think he's writing way over 30 books, and I know he's working on a new book right now. And Claes I never told him that, but I kind of feel that he is my mentor. He's 65, I'm 46, and I whenever we have conversations or communications, or recently we traveled Sweden for 5 days together, looking at cases. It's a man I'm very I admire because he's so great at what to do. I'm more esoteric. I'm more mumbo jumbo. So it's good for me to have that balance with a very rational person beside me.
Well, and it sounds like you're carrying the torch for all these influences, to.
I hope. I hope so. I hope so. But it's also, you know, I mean, I'm in the board of UFO Sverige, the main UFO organization. I'm very active in UFO Sverige. UFO Sverige is a more, I'd say, have a more rational approach than I have, because when I look into cases, I very much enjoy looking at the symbolism in it. I love looking at possible connections with, you know, folklore and, you know, nature spirits and all that kind of stuff. I'm really not. I mean, if you read the book, you notice that I rarely do any kind of debunking or anything. I kind of speculate sometimes, but I'm more interested in the stories of these people.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely my main interest with it.
Yeah, and what it means to the person that's having that experience.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's one of those things, you know, you notice when you talk with a lot of experiencers that it affects them so deeply. I mean, we have stuff that happened, 40 years ago, and they're still thinking about it every day.
Right.
We met a man now, like a week ago, Tommy, who had a quite weird experience in 2011, and he still gets very, very emotional when talking about this. You know, the tears comes because he had such a close-up of a giant UFO, whatever it was, and his wife saw it for a couple of seconds, but other than that, he's alone in his experience, and he wonders every day if anyone else saw it. Was it just him? Was it in his head? Did it show itself to him, especially for him, or was it something else? And it's so moving to talk with such a man and hear him analyze his experience, and you can sense. No, you can't say. You know how important this was to him, because it changed his whole view on life and the universe, and you encounter these things over and over again when you talk to people, and I find that very powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, seeing how it affects somebody, I think that, as you mentioned before, that helped you kind of become more of a believer in the paranormal, in a hidden world, because you saw how deeply it affected the people that had these encounters.
Oh yeah, for sure. It's meant a lot to me, listening to people and talking with them, and it made me. I mean, before this first paranormal show where we visited haunted homes, I must admit I was kind of an I don't know how to put it, an asshole maybe. It's when people. I was fascinated by the subject, absolutely. But every time I heard something, I was very, very quick to debunk it, often without, reason, basically. Maybe it pointed more towards my own insecurity about it and my age at the time. So I mean, talking with these people it has given so much to me. Now I'm almost sound religious here, and I'm not, but it's to listen to people, to talk with people directly is what I'd say the most important thing you can do. It's easy to read books and blogs and Wikipedia and but listening to people directly, eye to eye, it's something special. I love doing that.
Yeah, testimony and a lot of intangible things are communicated, I'm sure.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm also, I mean, since years back, I've also felt that those smaller experiences, or more intimate experiences with one or two witnesses, is the most important ones. I mean, I admit, and I don't want to make anyone pissed off out there, but I'm quite uninterested by, fighter pilots and Pentagon and stuff like that. I prefer the smaller human stories. I always felt that those.
We agree with that. We agree with that.
For
We're
sure.
not the same.
I'm just bored with the other stuff.
Right.
But when you hear someone who's been on a dark countryside road and they've seen a UFO or they see some strange being, and you listen to them, that's so much powerful than any kind of radar images or sonars or data, as people like to call it. Data. We need to collect data. I'd say that the most magnificent computer we have, or data collector, is the person itself, who see stuff through their perceptions, absolutely. But what they see, even if it's not objectively correct, says a lot more about human nature and themselves and us than many other things, and than technology itself.
I want to talk about the influence of folklore and about what specifically the Swedish folklore and some of those, especially things dealing with little people and those things, because that seems to have. Does that have an influence on kind of the nature of the sightings that you, not just with UFOs, but anything else that you've written about in the book? A lot of high strange episodes, a lot of things dealing with strange creatures and that type of thing. Does it have any influence on some of these people's sightings or their interpretation of it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we live in a country which have like 70% forest. So we have we have forest everywhere. I mean, as I mentioned before we started recording, I mean, I live in the suburbs to a big city. And if you walk 20 minutes or 10 minutes from the city center here, you have forests, miles of forests and lakes in every direction, basically. So we're so rooted in nature, and so is, of course, folklore with all its kind of, all the beings that lives there, and small people, little people. We call them vettar, but I will call them gnomes to make it easier for the listeners. They're kind of the same thing. Yeah. These stories are everywhere in Sweden, especially if you go outside the main cities. But you can hear about stuff like this even, in the more crowded parts of Sweden. And gnomes has been part of our folklore since, I don't know, hundreds of years, maybe 1,000 years. Before that, it was giants. But then the giants disappeared when the country got Christian once upon a time. So every farm out there have gnomes who lives on the farm, take care of the farm, and you need to be kind to them, of course, because they can be quite cheeky. Where did I want to go with this? Well, if you look back at older gnome sightings in Sweden, they're very, very, very similar to more modern UFO and humanoid sightings. I guess it's all about the perception of people, the culture around. But if you look back at stuff that happened in the 30s or 20s or even later, when people didn't have, they didn't know about flying saucers or aliens, the stuff they told and wrote down is basically it's exact same thing. One of my favorite cases is Helge Eriksson. I think it was in 1931 where he was walking from one farm to another. It was in the winter, and suddenly he meets like a dozen small men basically walking past him like they're marching. He made a comparison to militaries, but these men were like 1 meter tall, and they had big beards and grumpy faces and pointy hats, and they were talking. Yeah, it's and they were talking with each other in some unknown language. So they passed him like 1 meter away, and he could see how they were looking at him. But they didn't seem to like him, and they continued out on the field into a bright light, who then flew away. So it's like little green men entering a flying saucer, basically. Yeah. I know another case where actually I don't have so much details at the moment about it, but it was actually a family who had to fight off gnomes who were trying to get into their house.
Excellent.
Yeah. And they can also see how the gnomes then entered a bright light who flew away outside their house. So it's very,
that's
very
reminiscent of the Kelly Green Men, like the Hopkinsville Goblins.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, exactly. And I need to do some more research on it. I've been thinking about it for a long time, but with some of these older cases, it's a bit hard to find more information. This is something Klaus Swan have written about, so maybe I will ask him. Another one very folklorish thing happened in 1979. There was a girl called Lilian who was out walking at night. She was like 16, 17 years old. And she sees a classic flying saucer in a park. And she got scared, of course, when she saw it, because it's like something completely out of the ordinary. And then 2 humanoids, tall, slim humanoids with some kind of silky clothes, tight clothes, comes towards her, and they offers her to eat a piece of chocolate. And she's so scared, so she don't know what to do. She is frozen. She just paralyzed, basically, looking at them. So they kind of leave and fly away with their flying saucer. But that one is like it's a pretty modern case where you have the classic food offering from the other side. Yeah, and it feels like something from hundreds of years back, and but thankfully, she didn't take the chocolate, so which probably would have made her disappear for a while. But I talked a little bit about her. I have a whole chapter about it in the book, but she didn't want to talk about it, the case itself. But she said that it happened. And she's in her 60s now, I guess. So she still stand by her story.
You mentioned the lady fighting the troll or these little creatures. I mean, you have these little kind of goblin-like creatures. And in her case, where she saw these kind of more ethereal type of beings that I would kind of typify as like Tolkien's elves type. Are there that type of mythological folkloric creature as well, that more like that look more human? In a sense, is that something that is in Scandinavian folklore?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, fairies and elves and nature spirits in general have a very human look. They're often quite beautiful. They're tall, light-skinned, very, kind of etheric and kind of poetic when they talk. Even trolls, I mean, originally trolls in Sweden were quite beautiful, being. But in the beginning, I mean, like 100 years ago, we had an artist named John Bauer, and he started to paint trolls as these big, grotesque beings. And that kind of changed our perception of them visually. Yeah, but before that, a troll could transform itself to an owl or a cat also, or a fox, but they could also be beautiful people with, the classic, with huge fortunes inside the mouth.
I feel like these popular culture images, of course, they're filtered through Hollywood. Sophie and I were kind of talking about something similar earlier today, that a lot of this stuff is filtered through 19th century notions. You know, these images that were used in the 19th century popular culture.
In Sweden, especially when it comes to folklore creatures. And I'd say that the trolls are the best example of it. But I mean, for example, I mentioned the guy who saw 12 gnomes walking by. When he first started to talk about this experience in the early 70s, he didn't, describe them as, aliens or a UFO or something. It was gnomes he saw or something like that.
Right.
But if you go further a couple of years and he's been talking more about it, suddenly it's aliens. It's a flying saucer. Probably because that was the connection he could make. And of course, investigators in the 70s had, especially in Sweden, had a very strong bias that it was aliens and flying saucers, so they couldn't really look beyond that and probably detected him. So, and I mean, even today, when people have experiences that they often refer them to as aliens or something from space. But when I read about it, I feel that this is a fairy or this is a gnome or stuff like that. So yeah, for sure. And I mean it's everywhere like that, and it's interesting. I think I find it very interesting how the perception can change through culture, and what does that mean? What does it mean?
Because you talk a lot about these inner realities, I think you call them, and how they can impact the greater outside world, and later impacted by things like you talk about science fiction and whether being interested in these kind of modern folklores and would prime someone and make them more likely to experience this generation's version of these same kind of phenomena.
Yeah. And it's interesting too that you mentioned that about the trolls. Like I didn't know that, and I've always thought trolls were depicted as ugly, nasty creatures. But this is from the work of a 19th century artist, and then after his material becomes popular, people see it. Then all of a sudden, then they see a troll. It is a nasty, horrible creature.
Yeah. It's very fascinating. I'm sure this is it's the same all over the world, but when I was reading through the book after I've written it, and you read it through multiple times, and I noticed that I'd say that at least 95% of the observations, the experiences, are set on the countryside. It's winter, it's dark, and it's silent. There's no distractions around, and then people have a tendency to see these things. And I also feel that is a huge part of the folklore tradition, because folklore, comes from the countryside, comes from, desolate places or where there's few people. It's like I often joke that I hate the word portal. I think it's very, very silly. But it kind of feels like being alone out there in the darkness or under a starry sky kind of opens up something, if you're willing to, at least if you're relaxed and chill, and maybe your mind is empty, basically, then these things will happen, which I've rarely experienced something myself, and that's probably because I'm always in the suburbs somewhere, or I'm working, or I'm in the city. So I never have the time to just experience these things. But I hope one day that I'll do that.
Just as an aside, I thought this was an interesting story where you talked about the fairies or the little people, and you talked about how they were building a road, a highway, and they wanted to divert it to not bother the fairies.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which, it's something that actually has happened in Iceland. They've actually done that, where like they didn't want to a certain mound or something like that they didn't want bothered. But apparently it's a really dangerous stretch of road in Sweden.
I mean, on Iceland they have a much more respect for these kind of beings. I mean, the place you're referring to here is Skarvberget. It's a little bit up north, and it's still considered a very dangerous stretch of road. And I remember in the 90s there was a lot of headlines about this. Because the people living there in the area were protesting against the road and that they were building so much stuff, and of course accidents happened all the time. And those who were building the road, I can't find the English word for it now. They had to, release a statement to say that, we're aware of the problem. We think it's because it's just a kind of road where people drive too fast, so accidents happen. So, I mean, it gave a lot of headlines, this place. But I mean, it's still happening today. I mean, people still claim that this whole area is packed with gnomes and fairies and elves and other things, and you should drive there really carefully. Yeah, that's a classic location here in Sweden. And I mean, even I don't remember if I mentioned it in the book, but at the early 70s, up north in Sweden, you had a series of sightings of a small man standing by the road, very, very short. Everyone saw him as a gnome or something like that. Sometimes he had a box on his belly with a bright light coming out from it.
I mentioned that. Yeah,
which is also something that appears in a lot of UFO cases and humanoid cases. The box on the belly, which I find very, very interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. I mean, you did mention that there was another major case that you mentioned with that in the book.
Yeah. I think it's called like the little man of. I don't remember the name of the road at the moment, but it was quite big news at the time, and there was a lot of investigative stuff going into it. And I'm not sure what it was, or if it was just people, triggering themselves when they were reading about it. But there was some creepy encounters, especially dark roads. Along this river. I mean, we have this case with a man, I think he's waiting for the bus, and he sees this small man standing a few meters away from him, and he goes near, he walks to him, and there's this bright light coming out from his belly, or from the box on his belly, and he disappears. It is creepy, especially, I mean, wow. Especially up north, during winter, it's so dark up here. I mean, it's pitch black. So in the summer, it's basically daytime, 24 hours. But in the winter, you have like 3 hours of sunlight during the day. So when I lived up north, I mean, there was days, weeks where I never saw the sun, which was horrifying,
Wow.
Yeah. So it's a good place for weird events, for sure.
Do you think that a lot of this folklore is it in danger of being lost with modernization? And you mentioned so many people leaving these rural areas, and
I think this is something one can speculate a lot about. But I think there is a risk of losing it. Of it disappearing when people move away and move to the big cities. I also, maybe I sound cynical now, but I in this day and age with so much information and media, and there's so much things happening everywhere all the time. I also think that people. Now I'm generalizing a bit here, of course. I think people are losing their imagination, and I think imagination is something you need to be able to experience these things. I'm not saying what they experience is, hallucinations or anything, but I think the imagination is a huge part of seeing stuff, or it affects your perception. So when people it's a tsunami of information everywhere. People are too tired to bother about that strange noise in the forest. They think it's they ignore it, or they want to find directly a rational explanation instead of thinking about gnomes or fairies or trolls or stuff like that. So I also think this information tsunami we have always constantly kind of makes us a bit less talented in just using our own mind, using our own imagination. It ties. Maybe I sound cynical about it, but that's what I feel, at least.
Yeah. Well, I think most people would echo that sentiment.
Yeah. It's a pity, but that's why it's so good to go outside the big cities. UFO Sverige has done a couple of projects during the last years where they basically go to a rural sorry, what do you say in English? Rural area. Sorry, it's early in the morning and I'm Swedish, so that's how it is. And they just go around and they knock on doors. They can do a whole town or a village or an area, and they just knock on doors and ask, "Hey, have you seen something you can't explain?" And they have they know now that at least 10% in every area, 10% of the people have seen something strange that they can't explain. Yeah. And that's quite a lot. That means, we're 10 million in people in Sweden now. That means like at least 1 million have experienced something out of the ordinary, and they don't talk about it because no one asks. Maybe people are afraid to ask because they don't want to sound, intrusive or stupid or whatever, and people are afraid to talk because they don't want to be mocked.
Right.
So I feel to do this, for example, these TV shows I've done and written this book, I hope to encourage people to talk about it. It's not silly, it's not hallucinations. People experience stuff. You have to respect that. So I'm there's a lot of stuff out there. Yeah.
That's like a paranormal census.
Yeah.
In the book too, you talk about a contactee. I'm probably going to butcher this. Is it Auntie Johnson?
Yes. Yeah.
And I guess he's kind of is he the best well-known contactee in Sweden? Or?
No, I'd say he's one of the more interesting ones. We had more famous ones like Sten Lindgren and Daniel Glans, but you have to take their stories, to be honest, with a grain of salt. When it comes to Ante, he's interesting for several reasons. He had this bizarre encounter in 1984 where he's out driving. He's driving home to have, spend some time with friends, and he sees a large black UFO hovering above a field near the edge of the forest. And he sees this, and he's a photographer, or he was a photographer. So he drives home directly to get his camera. He wakes up his wife, says he needs to photograph this UFO, and he disappears again. And when he comes back, there's no UFO there. So he drives around, and suddenly this giant craft shows up again over a road, and he almost crashes his car. So the car gets stuck in the snow, and he have this craft very, very close to the car, and he looks up at it and he's so scared. So he tries to get out from the car, and when he leaves the car, he can feel that someone is, grabbing him by the arm. And then I think it's like three humanoid dwarfs in kind of like the dwarfs in Whitley Strieber's Communion, who start dragging him towards the UFO, like they want to abduct him. And he really fights with them basically, and he's saved by a truck. There's a truck coming along the road, and for some reason the aliens get scared by it and they run away and into the UFO and disappears. What's interesting here is that he goes back to the car, and a little bit before this, someone is calling the police, probably the truck driver. And the truck driver says to the police that he sees a car stuck in the snow, and there's a big black thing hovering above it. So when the police and ambulance come, they find Ante in shock in the car. They have to, really bend his fingers so he will let go of the wheel, and bring him to a hospital. So after that kind of sets off many years of contacts with beings from planet Prio, and they take him out on journeys in the universe, and they give him gifts, sometimes technical equipment, which he never shows to anyone, but also stones. Some of them are still left. So he did this for many years. He wrote down everything that happened to him, and I think he passed away. I don't remember the year now, if it was 2011 or 2013. And when his family came to the retirement home to take care of his things, the staff told them that there's already been 2 men in black suits there who claimed they were his family, and they took all his notes, all his papers, all his stuff from his space journeys. So we have a little Men in Black episode there at the end of it also.
Right. You seem in the book to have some doubts about his story, that he might have been making some things up, or...
I mean, with many of these guys... Sure. There's always inconsistencies in the stories. There is some. I mean, the original incident is basically the same, but there's a few details changing here and there, and he adds some stuff and he retracts some stuff. But when it comes to the contactee part, I've always, I'm not sure what to make of it. I totally respect them if I feel that they're not, frauds, just in it for the money or anything. If they seem to have sincere, honest, genuine experiences, but what is it? Is it just something in their heads, or is it something physical, or is it both? And if it's in their heads, can you say that it's not real? Yeah, I mean, it's real for them. So what's reality? What I kind of like about Ante is that, first of all, he always claimed that these events made him a happier person. He was fine with it. He enjoyed it. It made his life richer. He was always worried that they would, stop coming to him, because he loved doing these trips. He never really capitalized on his experience either. He didn't want to become a guru. He didn't want to make money on it. So he kind of kept to himself, basically. He just enjoyed his time with the aliens. And I respect that part a lot. But, if it happened for real or not, I'm absolutely not sure. There's... like I said, there's always things like this one with contactees. I've experienced, at least, that you kind of walk the fine line between unreal and real, and that by itself I find fascinating.
Yeah, that's true. Of unreality. We'll talk a little bit about some of the stories here that you talk about in the book.
Yeah, because it was very refreshing that these are, mostly new cases to us, and we hear so much of the same stories from the U.S. over and over again that it was really refreshing to hear a lot of these that were, in the Swedish context.
Yeah, things we'd never heard before.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One reason why I wrote the book is that I wanted to share these stories. I mean, there's written in Swedish about them, and some of them are mentioned briefly or quite rewritten in, for example, Flying Saucer Review. But I also noticed that when reading these international versions of them, there's a lot of things getting lost in translation, so to speak. There's, I don't know what you say in English, the whispering game, when you whisper something in someone's ear, they will whisper. It's kind of
right.
turns into something new, or
we call it telephone.
Telephone, yeah. Okay, yeah. So I decided to go back to, in most cases, the original reports, the original articles, to just check what did really happen. And I mean, I found so many cool stories. And often I felt that by looking into them deeper and look at the original witness reports, I found them even more interesting, even more, multi-layered and fascinating. So I don't know, is there any story in specific you're curious about?
A couple that come to mind. There were a few that I really thought were interesting. Some of them we've already covered. But the Flogberg mine, the Frogmen in Black. Mm-hmm. We talked about the boxes, the guys carrying the boxes with the light in them.
Yes.
So the Flogberg mine one, I mean, this is people encountering something inside of a mine, which is reminiscent of what we talked about with Maxim Furyk not too long ago, where the guy's trapped in a mine in Pennsylvania and them seeing entities and things down in the mine. But this was more of this wasn't workers. This is more like an abandoned mine, as I understood it.
Yeah, the whole area there in Smedjebacken has a lot of abandoned mine and facilities around. It's Sweden is basically like a Swiss cheese. You have tunnels everywhere, and I mean, I remember where my mother lives. It can be quite dangerous to go out in the forest, because suddenly there could be like a 20-meter deep hole in front of you. They try, of course, to fence them in, but so in Smedjebacken. And Benny had this fascinating experience together with his friends. I guess they were like between 10, 11, 12 years old at the time, and they were building a hut or, playing cowboy and Indian or something like that out in the forest, quite close to this mine. And they didn't see these two creatures coming up from the mine, but they showed up at the edge of it. And they were tall. They had white clothes. I kind of see them as some kind of hazmat suits. And they were holding, each held some kind of bag, and they had covered heads. And the boys kind of saw them as these giants. I mean, like maybe they're 2.5 meters tall with big black eyes. And they were looking at the boys. And the boys were looking at them, and then they started to run. And these two beings were following them, kind of by the side of the trail in the forest, kind of floating in the air, kind of in slow motion. It felt like they were in a separate reality, kind of. For Benny, this was a major event in his life. I mean, it basically set off a lifetime of experiences. I talked with him on phone regarding this, and he basically confirms the whole story. He brought it down a few notches. But he also told me about all the the weird experiences he had after this. He, up until this day, what I understand, he see these big saucer-shaped golden discs hovering above lakes and over forests because he likes to go out fishing. It's a story where I have my doubts, to be honest, because I think there might be something else. I mean, it could be moonshiners scaring the kids, for example, because it was quite common for them to have their equipment in abandoned places during the time. It was a lot of moonshining in that area. But then again, what's most important here is Benny's experience and what it gave him. I don't mention it in the book, but I always felt, not always, but I feel that the phenomenon itself can kind of take humans and animals as some kind of proxies for itself. So, I mean, even if, for example, Men in Black, where people meet some weird men, maybe they're just, ordinary, some military or police or ufologists, but the experience itself makes them weirder and stranger than they really are, and that's a part of the phenomenon itself, because they use it. It uses these encounters, which can be quite normal, objectively looking at it, but just because the phenomenon is involved, they become stranger and kind of communicates with us or with the witnesses. And I kind of feel it's the same with Benny's experience by the mine. Maybe it was just some moonshiners or some workers or something like that. But for some reason, this opened up a whole new world for him, with all the stuff he have seen since then, and even for him, it's a very positive thing. I guess it's easy when you had an experience that it can be quite destructive. You're wondering, you're frustrated, you want to see it again. You're thinking about what could it be. But I love guys like Benny or Ante who just goes with it. They don't seem to worry too much. They're just having fun. I wish more people could react that way after an experience. But who am I to judge there, because I really haven't experienced so much myself. But I think you know what I mean.
Sure.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. And you have a chapter entitled "Frogmen in Black" as well.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a weird one.
Yeah, the Frogmen in Black. Yeah, absolutely. You have to. I mean, Men in Black observations in Sweden are very, very rare, and I think I mentioned it somewhere that, I mean, compared to the United States, which has a long tradition of secrecy, which by itself creates paranoia, I mean, Sweden is very open. I mean, I have not far from where I live, I have a military area, and no one, maybe I'm, risking my life, but I'm always in this area, and sometimes I meet militaries and no one cares, and they have these operations in there. It's a very different approach to stuff here in Sweden. So I think it's less paranoia and less stories about Men in Black because of that. But the Frogmen in Black is interesting. As I mentioned, we had the submarine flap in the 80s where people saw submarines everywhere, which was huge. Some of them were probably Soviet submarines, some were not. Then we had this guy called Jan-Ove Sundberg, who passed away by now, who was convinced that these machines were actually UFOs or USOs. Investigating our shorelines, and in them, of course, there would be frogmen, alien frogmen, or frogmen in black, as I call them. And this, the stuff that Jan Ove has written down is, I'm pretty sure there is some reality behind them. People actually met something or someone dressed as a frogman. But Jan Ove, you have to understand that he was kind of a trickster personality, not the most sympathetic one either. Everywhere, especially if you look, for example, in Flying Saucer Review in the 70s, you see his name pop up from time to time. He have experienced something, or he has written something, and that's a little warning, because then you might not be sure if what he writes is true or not. So he's written about Bigfoot in Sweden, and of course UFOs and this frogman. He wrote a whole book about frogmen in black and USOs. I don't really know what so much to say about them, except that they're rooted in Men in Black traditions, with frogmen behaving odd, looking slightly odd, having either very, very generic traditional accents, or they have some odd accent when they're talking. And they often asking weird questions, like they can stand by the water and ask where the water is, for example. Or, like just Men in Black do, They,
nonsensical things.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, depending if you believe Jan Ove or not, I think that this frogman clearly belongs in the Men in Black traditions. But why so many frogmen encounters in Sweden? I don't know. Of course, we have a lot of sea around, and we have lots of lakes. But they're weird cases. I just don't know what to believe of them. But I felt they're good stories, at least.
Right. And even though you say, that Sweden isn't totally captured by the national security state like the place like the United States, but you all and Greater Scandinavia was still a pretty important place during the Cold War. I'm wondering how you feel that impacted any of this UFO mythology in Sweden, and were threats of apocalypse and things like that, did they play a role in any of this?
Yeah, especially when it comes to the submarines and the frogmen, I'd say they're clearly an offspring of the paranoia regarding the Soviet and the Cold War. Recently, like 1 year ago, we had you can say a similar flap, but with drones around, nuclear plants and government buildings, and people saw drones everywhere. And the newspaper started to speculate that, these must be Russians, the Russians again. And it's basically the exact same thing as the submarines. Or even if you go back to the ghost rockets or the ghost airplanes, you have these speculations in times of war and paranoia, and it affects people. When it comes to these drones, there were a ton of sightings with drones around nuclear plants, but they couldn't actually find proof for any of them that any of them actually happened. People maybe just saw stars or airplanes in the distance and thought they were drones. So it's and we live pretty close to Russia, and so it's been affecting media and the people's perception of danger out here. People are more paranoid. They're arresting possible spies or Russian citizens who are maybe have taken too many photos of the royal castle, stuff like that. It's kind of on edge sometimes. So I'm absolutely sure that, especially when you go back to the 80s, it had it was very affected by the Cold War, definitely. Oddly enough, not so much about flying objects like UFOs. We had a couple of crashes in lakes. We have the Namajaura in, I think it was 80 or 81, where two witnesses saw a very clear craft of some sort land in a lake and kind of let itself sink. And in 99, we had also a ton of witnesses who saw a craft around 2-3 meters in diameter, a triangular crash into a lake in Värmland. And Värmland is quite close to Norway. And the border between Norway and Sweden has always been very important during war, and it's easy to smuggle things and do things out in this forest because it's so far away from everything.
I want to get to this, the reality shifts, kind of like the time slips that you've written about also in the book. I thought these were really interesting. I thought that was a really interesting chapter.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I first began writing that chapter specifically dealing with the first incident where 3 people saw a car disappear on a bridge, and later the car appeared on a small islet a couple of hours later, which by itself is a very, very weird event. But when writing this, I suddenly remembered that an old coworker of mine had told me a story, an experience he had, and I contacted him again and said, "Can you tell me the story again? I can record it because I need to get it down on in both in audio and paper." And he told me this. I mean. You need to hear him talk about this because he does it so well. This was in, I don't remember the year now, but he and his son had been shooting a music video at a small hotel on the island they live, Öland. And it was December 20th or 21, and they were driving home. And this island is, of course, very close to the sea, so it always have a quite famous blue fog. And this blue fog turned green, and they found themselves lost on roads that it's impossible to get lost on because all the roads are very, very straight. I mean, you have one road that goes straight over the island. It's like one long stretch. And this guy, Jan, is also a bus driver, and he knows these roads like the back of his hand. And they just couldn't get out from this area. They were just driving, and they were noticing that all the lights were out. Whenever they passed the house, it was dark. There were no signs by the road, where to turn, where to go. The odd thing also that this is a very, very flat island. This island doesn't have hills. But suddenly they found themselves driving downwards for a couple of kilometers, which is absolutely impossible. And they're also passing, pine tree forest, which is very, very rare. And you just don't have that in that part of the island. Jan also starts to get very worried. They get very scared because they're lost on roads that they know very well. And he starts to sense a danger. I mean, he stops the car to try to, locate where he is. He can smell the pine trees, for example. It's a detail he remembers very, very vividly. And then he feels that something is coming from behind. Something is after them. And they get into the car again and continues to drive, still absolutely lost out there, until finally they see some lights far away, and it's their hometown, their part of the island where they live, and suddenly they kind of come back to our reality again. And Jan Jan, first of all, he's still very moved when he talks about this, because it's an experience he and his son shared. His son refuses to talk about it. He finds it very disturbing. His ex-wife, they were married at the time, didn't want to talk about it at all when he got home. It's like it's too weird to even mention. So he feels that he entered some kind of other reality for sure, because he says this is not the place where I usually drive, and it's impossible to I mean, you can't find these kind of locations on the island. And I absolutely, to 100% trust Jan in this. He's a good friend. I've known him for many, many years, and I see no reason why he should make these things up. What makes it even weirder that a couple of months later, my uncle who lives on the island sent me an email and said, "Hey, Fred, I've experienced something weird this summer," and he also got lost on this stretch of the road that goes straight over the island. There's no turns, you can't go anywhere. You can just go straight ahead, and he got lost on that road. He's an what do you say? Or he's a bird watcher. What do you call it? Ornithologist. So
I do not know.
Yeah, he was.
Yep, that's the name. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, he was out looking for birds in the night together with his partner, and somehow they managed to get 2-3 kilometers on the side. They weren't even on the road anymore when they finally was able to locate where they were, and that was my mind was blown when he emailed me this, because I haven't mentioned the other story to him, and this is the exact same area also. So it's like it's the same place, which for me is like, wow, what's going on out there?
Yeah, and you mentioned too that there was another story where you felt like it was the opposite was happening, where someone was watching someone being pulled, or watching them come in and out of time, basically.
Yeah,
that was a strange story.
Yeah. That's the first story I'm going through. Yeah, you had these 3 friends going on vacation out to the archipelago in Stockholm. They had a cabin on a small islet, and they're going to drive over a quite narrow bridge. And they see, I think it's a brown Volvo coming from the other side. So they pull into the road to let it pass. But the Volvo disappears. There's no car there. And they kind of get worried, did it, crashed into the water or something like that? So they drive around and trying to find it. It's completely gone. It's just in front of their eyes, basically. So they continue to the boat. They go out with the boat to this little island, and they start to chill. Probably they open a beer, maybe start the sauna, because they were Finnish and they always do sauna.
Oh yeah,
yeah, and they hear a loud bang on this small islet. They hear a loud bang, and they look up. And maybe 50 or 70 meters away, they see this brown Volvo on the island driving inside the forest. And moments later, they see how all the trees are kind of pushed down, like they describe it as a giant hand. But it's invisible, of course, kind of presses the trees down and even breaks some of them. And the car disappears, and they go there and they can find one tree. It's quite thick tree that has been completely broken. And that's I've been trying to find these people. I think 2 of them have passed away by now, and there is a third one also, but I haven't been able to locate him yet, because I would like to talk to them more about this. What did really happen out there? But I like that story. It's so absurd, and it's so I can see it in front of me, how they're out there chilling with a beer, and suddenly they see this damn Volvo again.
Yeah.
on a place where it can't be. There's no, you can't have a car there. There's no roads on this island. It's just out driving on their little island. That's strange.
Yeah, very strange. One last thing. These weird like manta rays that people see in the sky.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There is a few of them, yeah. Yeah, big manta rays, kind of sometimes a little bit stiffer, with less movements, and sometimes moving around like they're swimming up there. I mean, there's a bunch of those cases, but the one I'm mostly fascinated by is we have a former comedian and TV host who was out walking on a field near Stockholm, what I understand, and he looked up and he saw this big manta ray kind of just minding its own business above him. It's a huge black one. I guess he just saw the silhouette of it. I think those are cool. I mean, we had incidents where people see what looks like a big fish also.
Yeah.
And that's weird also. And there's a chapter called like the wings of a dragonfly, where Jürgen and Ulrika, a very, very nice couple, out driving, see a ball, a sphere hanging from a thick stem of some kind with two giant wings attached to it, kind of floating above the road, and they actually hit it with a car. So I'm fascinated by these kind of half animalistic flying objects out there. It makes me question if, I mean, like in the movie Nope, are we talking about some kind of organic creatures out there or something? I don't know.
Yeah, that's the first thing I thought of when I read that chapter. Yeah.
Yeah. One I didn't have, I don't have in the book. It happened in Värmland, and I'm very, very fascinated by it. It was a woman. It was early in the morning, and she was going out in her garden and just looking around a little bit, and suddenly she sees very close to her, by her feet, a green little creature. I mean, as big as a tennis ball, maybe, or a little bit larger, with two very human eyes looking up at her. And she stands looking at this. They kind of meet their eyes with each other, and they just look at each other. And she's so confused, she just walks in again, and then she goes back because, like, what did I see? What what kind of creature was this? But of course, it was gone when she came back. So there's a bunch of weird creatures flying and running around out in the Swedish forests.
All right.
I think on that note, I think that's a good place to end it.
Well, you're very welcome to Sweden. If you ever come to Sweden, just let me know, and I will show you some places.
Awesome.
Absolutely. That'd be
I've
great.
been to Norway and I liked it very much. So Sweden should be
Yeah.
my next Scandinavian step.
We got friends in Sweden, Sergio. Who would have thought? Fred, excellent book. Really enjoyed it, and really I want to thank you for coming on Conspirinormal. What is next for you, and where can people find the book?
Well, the book is easy to find. It's available everywhere, basically online right now. But I guess the most easy way is to buy it through Amazon or bookshop.org if you don't want to support Amazon, which I totally understand. Up next for me, I'm still struggling with what my next book will be about, of course, but I'm also focusing a lot on this UFO show I'm working on, and I will work intensively with that one until the end of November. I will also, if everything works out, I will be one of the speakers at Anomacon, which is somewhere in the skies online conference in September. And I will talk about UFO encounters before 1947 in Sweden. So it's a lot of.
Okay.
It will be a pre-recorded talk, and I'm planning to do it tomorrow. So cross your fingers that I will do it, because I've been pushing it in front of me way too long now.
Gotcha. All right. Well, sounds like you got some good things on the table. I want to thank you for coming on, Fred. Stay on the line for us, though, as we're going to close out the show. I just want to remind everyone that Strange Realities Conference is coming up November 3rd through the 5th, 2 days at SIR Nashville and 1 day online. Of course, the whole thing is streaming online, and by this time this is posted up, you're going to be able to find tickets. You go to strangerealitiesconference.com. And there is also Patreon, which you guys, if you want to feel free to support us, we have some levels there, and we have some things going on there as well. So
you can find that at patreon.com/Conspirinormal.
And if you come into the conference, please do so, because this may possibly be the last time we do it, at least in this type of format. So strangerealitiesconference.com, we want to see you there, or we want to see you online. Without further ado, I think we'll close out the show, Sir Fiel. I think next time I'm going to interview you, right? That's what we're going to do. Yeah, so that will be the next episode. No, we said it would be this episode, but we switched a little bit of things around. But I'm looking forward to doing that and what he has to say. All right, guys, we'll be back next time on Conspirinormal.